As the Sahel faces its worst drought in 70 years, two unlikely voices, Jasmine Crockett and President Ibrahim Traoré, rise from opposite ends of the world to confront a truth the global powers won't say out loud, that water is no longer a right, but a weapon. With millions dying of thirst and silence pouring from G20 nations, a single sentence from Washington ignites a storm across Africa. One stood against a $400 million contract. The other blocked a bill that could have stripped clean water from the poor. Together, they lit a fire the world couldn't ignore. When the world starts selling survival to the highest bidder, who will be brave enough to break the auction? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The warning hit like a shock wave through the corridors of global power. The Sahel is collapsing. The United Nations had issued its most severe climate alert in decades. The worst drought in 70 years was turning West Africa into a slow-motion graveyard. Crops had vanished. Livestock lay shriveled in the sun. Winds swept across once green fields, now cracked and colorless. In Burkina Faso, the crisis had become catastrophic. Over 3 million people without reliable access to water, entire towns migrating in desperation, mothers feeding dust to their children in place of bread. Aerial footage showed rivers as ribbons of bone-dry sediment, reservoirs sinking into shadows, aid trucks immobilized in scorching terrain. But what made the silence unbearable wasn't just the scale of the suffering, it was the indifference. The very nations that had extracted Africa's minerals, oil, and groundwater for profit were now watching from climate-controlled offices as the land they stripped cried out. It wasn't a drought, it was vengeance dressed as weather. And those who had never tasted thirst could not comprehend the scream in the soil. In response, a global emergency summit was hastily convened, not by the world's oldest powers, but by its boldest young leaders. This wasn't Davos. There were no suits for show, no empty applause. This was urgency, fire, resolve. Among the most commanding voices was President Ibrahim Traoré, barely into his 30s but already a symbol of sovereign defiance. He stood flanked by maps, data streams, and handwritten testimonies from dying farmers. Burkina Faso wasn't just a casualty, it was the epicenter. Traoré, once branded radical for nationalizing water infrastructure, was now being hailed as prophetic. But he needed the world to listen, and fast. And so, across oceans and ideologies, the summit organizers made a call that stunned Washington. Invite Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Not because she was the obvious choice, but because she wasn't. Because when America cut water access in rural Alabama and Flint, she fought. Because she didn't speak from podiums, she yelled from protest lines. And now, at a time when billionaires were buying bottled silence, she was the one voice too stubborn to ignore. The world had seen summits of polished speeches and marble stages, but this time, the most powerful messages came from broken ground and battered hearts, standing miles apart but bleeding from the same wound. The live feed opened with a brutal kind of honesty. No soft lighting, no filtered press room, just raw reality. The sun scorched the screen, casting sharp lines across President Ibrahim Traoré's face as he stood, not behind a podium, but in the center of a dead rice field in northern Burkina Faso. The land beneath him was no longer soil, it was cracked clay, deep fissured like the skin of a starving animal. This was once the economic heart of the region, where families harvested enough grain to feed cities. Now not a blade of green remained. Behind Traoré, the skeletons of irrigation arms twisted like broken limbs against a lifeless horizon. Two barefoot children in tattered uniforms stood silently in the background, each clutching a yellow water container that hadn't been filled in days. There were no flags fluttering, no national anthem playing, only a keening wind that carried the dust of ruin. When Traoré finally spoke, his voice didn't rise. It fell, low, firm, unshaken by pity. "This field," he said, lifting a handful of sun-baked dirt that sifted like ash through his fingers, "once fed 20,000 people a year. Now it cannot even hold a shadow." He paused, eyes locked on the camera, as if daring the world to look away. Burkina Faso is not dying because of drought. Drought is nature. This, he gestured at the endless expanse of ruin, is the result of extraction without repair, trade without justice, aid without dignity. Behind him, a rusted water tank wheezed like an exhausted lung. A satellite tower blinked weakly in the distance. Out of signal, out of time. For a long moment, no one dared to speak. He wasn't asking for help. He was demanding responsibility. The second feed flickered to life from thousands of miles away, where Jasmine Crockett sat in a dim congressional side room in Washington, D.C., lit only by the blue glow of her laptop screen. Her blazer was rumpled, the sleeves rolled up past her elbows, her throat raw from a 10-hour floor battle that had just ended in a rare personal victory. She had stopped a water defunding bill dead in its tracks, a bill designed to quietly strip millions in federal support from America's poorest zip codes under the guise of reallocation. Her fingers were still stained with red Sharpie ink from the notes she'd scrawled in fury mid-debate. Stacked around her were manila folders marked with names like Flint, Jackson, East Street, Louis. She didn't need a stage. She had receipts. "I'm not speaking to you from a drought zone," she began, voice hoarse, lips dry. "But don't be mistaken. There is a war on water in my country, too." Her tone was steel. "Only we don't let the rivers dry. We poison them." She held up a photo, an 8-year-old girl holding a glass of brown tap water, face hollow, gums swollen. And when communities protest, they're told to wait, to boil, to pray. Her hand trembled, but her gaze did not. "So no, I'm not here as a politician. I'm here as someone who has fought tooth and nail to make sure my people don't have to choose between thirst and infection." She paused. "President Traoré stands in a field that the world abandoned. I stand in a nation that's still abandoning its own." Her final words hit like a blade through stone. Different geography, same betrayal. Jasmine inhaled slowly, almost as if steadying herself against a storm that hadn't passed, but had only gotten quieter, more invisible, more insidious. And then she said her name. "Her name was Tasha Monique Ellis," Jasmine said, her voice flattening into something deadly precise. 8 years old, 3rd grade, born and buried in Bullock County, Alabama. No press, no protest, just a casket barely 4 feet long. She held up a laminated photo, trembling slightly under the overhead light. The child in the image stared ahead, expression hollow, not out of shyness, but exhaustion. Her skin had turned a pale gray near the lips, her fingernails bluish with oxygen loss. The audience could see the hospital band on her wrist, the kind worn by the uninsured, issued, not printed. Jasmine's jaw tightened. This girl died because the well her family relied on was poisoned, with lead, iron bacteria, fecal contaminants, and God knows what else. The state called it a rural filtration deficiency. I call it negligent homicide by public policy. Her tone never rose, but every syllable was an indictment. No early warning, no replacement system, no emergency water truck, just a girl, burning with infection, vomiting blood by the 3rd day, and dead by the 5th. Her hand, still holding the photo, dropped to her side like a weapon she refused to holster. "And her crime?" she asked, staring down the lens. "Being born where the pipes don't reach and where the votes don't count." The air in the summit chamber turned viscous, like time itself had thickened under the weight of what she said. "Don't tell me this is a global South problem," she continued, voice quieter now, but ironclad. "Tasha died in the most powerful country on earth, and no one even said her name on the House floor. No congressional moment of silence, no flag at half-mast, because her death wasn't dramatic enough. It was just slow, humiliating, and invisible." Her hand reached out and rested gently on the thick folder beside her, labeled U.S. Water Neglect Cases, Undisclosed. She didn't need to open it. "We bury our poor quietly in this country. We tell them the system failed, as if that system wasn't designed to forget them." Then after a long, blistering pause, she delivered the line that dropped like a blade. "We live in 2 different worlds, but we are dying of the same thing. Indifference made policy." Still holding Tasha's photo, Jasmine exhaled, then pivoted, not away from pain, but towards something far rarer in modern leadership: moral courage in the face of impossible temptation. "There's something I need to say," Jasmine began, her voice lower now. but every syllable was deliberate, like a judge preparing to read a verdict. Because while the world drowns in indifference, there are people who choose to stand between their people and the jaws of profit. She looked directly at the screen that projected the summit's most unexpected figure, President Ibrahim Traoré, standing not in the halls of economic power, but in the dust of a country still fighting for air. Mr. President, she continued, you were offered a deal that could have changed your entire economic trajectory. A water rights contract from a European multinational syndicate. The numbers were dazzling. $412 million. Upfront, immediate. No strings they admitted to. She paused, not for dramatic effect, but because the reality of that number deserved to hang in the air like a live wire. You were told it would build roads, that it would modernize your grid, that it would employ hundreds. But what they didn't put in their press release was what they wanted in return: control of your subterranean aquifers for 30 years, bottling plants in foreign hands, export routes bypassing your own communities, and access clauses so airtight that even your own farmers would need to pay premiums to use water pulled from beneath their own land. She stepped forward now, her tone thick with both admiration and restrained fury. Most leaders in the world today would have signed that deal by sundown, smiled for the cameras, and told their people to be grateful for trickle-down charity. But you didn't, she said, her voice tightening. You read the fine print, and then you did something almost unheard of in modern governance. You said no. Her hands trembled slightly as she gestured toward him across the digital divide. You told them that water is not a commodity, that sovereignty is not for lease, that your people's thirst is not an investment opportunity. Her voice cracked, not with weakness, but with uncontainable conviction. Do you know how rare that is? I've watched my own government buckle under lobbying worth a fraction of what they offered you. I've seen policymakers auction off the future for the price of one re-election cycle. She let the silence stretch for a moment, letting the weight of that decision land on everyone in the room. You could have made yourself a global darling with one signature. You could have padded your GDP, shut your critics up, and smiled in every summit photo from here to Davos. Then she raised her hand, not to accuse, but to salute. But instead, you chose the child who walks 6 miles for a bucket of water, the elder who bathes once a week so her grandchildren can drink, the farmer who sees clouds but still plants, praying the soil will remember rain. You chose them. Her closing line wasn't delivered in triumph. It was spoken like a vow, heavy and still. You chose people with cracked lips over men with gold pens, and I have not seen a single G20 leader do the same. As Jasmine's final words echoed through the summit chamber, not a soul dared to speak, but in the silence the camera found him again. Not speaking, not nodding, simply still. President Ibrahim Traoré sat motionless, not out of politeness, not for effect, but because something inside him had shifted, something too heavy for language, too immediate for applause. The blistered wind swept across the dead field behind him, carrying dust into the creases of his uniform. But he didn't flinch. His gaze was fixed, not on the camera, not on the advisors frozen beside him, but far beyond, as if staring into the very future of his country, now trembling beneath the weight of Jasmine's words. To his left, a young aide leaned forward, uncertain, lips parting to speak, then stopping, struck dumb by the look on his president's face. It was the look of a man who had just had a wound named aloud in front of the world. The summit's moderator hesitated, unsure whether to transition to the next speaker. Even the signal technicians held their breath. And then it happened. A moment so small, it could have been missed by everyone. Except the camera never blinked. Traoré slowly reached into the inside pocket of his weather-worn jacket, pulled out an old pen with chipped paint near the grip, and without a word began unrolling the stiff cuff of his sleeve. No notepad, no tablet, no formal parchment. Just to his shirt, the very cloth touching his skin, was the surface he chose. With quiet, almost reverent precision, he pressed the pen against the fabric and began to write. The ink bled slightly on the linen, but he didn't stop. His hand trembled, not from nerves but from knowing this moment could never be erased. He wrote a single line, paused, then underlined it twice, harder the second time. the tip of the pen nearly puncturing the cotton. The cameras couldn't catch the words, but they captured something deeper. A man marking his soul in cloth, not for show, but for memory. When he was done, he clenched the sleeve in his fist, folding the fabric like a vow, and looked back at the screen, his silence louder than any anthem. But there's a line between empathy and experience. And when Jasmine stepped back from global policy to speak from the scar tissue of her own past, the summit no longer felt like a diplomatic event. It felt like confession under fire. "I don't speak about this often," Jasmine said, her voice dropping to a weight that made even microphones strain to catch it. "Because in rooms like these, we talk about percentages, budgets, impact reports. But poverty has no press release." Her fingers curled slowly around the edge of the podium, as though steadying herself against something rising from deep inside. "When I was a child, the water was shut off in our home for almost 3 months. Not once. Not during a freak storm. Not because the city failed, but because we were invisible. We didn't matter enough for someone to fix the meter, or forgive the overdue bill, or even answer the phone." She swallowed hard. The taps didn't drip. They hissed like they were mocking us. Every faucet was a reminder that survival had to be improvised. Her breath caught slightly before she continued. "My mother, God, she tried. Every day, she'd walk half a mile to the retention pond behind the old supermarket. There were cigarette butts floating in it, frogs nesting. One summer, the carcass of a raccoon rotted on the edge. She knew it wasn't safe, but when you have a child crying from hunger, you don't wait for safe. You pray over dangerous and hope it's enough." Her voice started to fracture, but she refused to stop. She used an old white t-shirt to strain the pond water. Then she'd stir it into powdered rice, sometimes with canned peas if the church pantry had extras that week. "That's what I ate. Not because she failed, but because the system failed her." She looked up, eyes burning. Not with tears, but with defiance carved from memory. "Do you know what it feels like to sit in a classroom knowing your skin smells like mildew? To avoid drinking during school hours because you're scared the teacher will notice your lips cracking? To wake up at night and listen for water, not because you expect it, but because somewhere in your heart, you still believe maybe the faucet will change its mind?" She leaned forward, eyes locking into the camera like crosshairs. "That kind of humiliation doesn't wash off. It embeds in your bones. And no politician, no bureaucrat, no diplomat, no economist can understand it unless they've knelt beside a rusted bathtub, holding a plastic bucket, praying rainwater will come before another week begins." She had spoken of shame, of pond water and sleepless nights. But now her voice rose not just from memory, but from conviction forged in battle, as she turned to the room and set her eyes on the world's most powerful players. "If there is still one place on this planet," Jasmine said, voice steady and unblinking, "where human dignity is placed above resource value, then that place is called Burkina Faso." The room fell even quieter. Delegates froze mid-note. Technicians stopped their adjustments. The entire summit leaned closer, as if they knew something monumental was about to pass through the air, and feared missing it. She wasn't shouting, but her words hit like stone against glass. "At a time when nations are measuring the worth of land by what they can dig out of it, there stands one country that said no, no to foreign hands mapping out aquifers like oil fields. No to billion-dollar development deals that leave people thirsty at the edge of sparkling export plants. No to the idea that life-giving water should belong to the highest bidder." Her hands gripped the podium now, not for balance, but as if she were anchoring herself in truth. "You see," she continued, her tone sharpening, "Burkina Faso was offered everything short of a crown. Multinational syndicates lined up at their door with contracts wrapped in gold. $412 million. Private water extraction rights, foreign infrastructure, debt forgiveness, prestige at summits like this one. All they had to do was sign over the right to their own veins, the rivers beneath their soil." She paused for a long, breathless second. "And they said no." She looked directly at the screen projecting President Traoré's solemn figure. "You, sir, put your people before your profit. You chose children with cracked lips over shareholders with polished shoes. You chose wells that still belong to villagers over vaults that would have silenced them forever. And I've watched world leaders sign away far more for far less. Her voice darkened, tinged with both sorrow and contempt. In Washington, I've seen members of Congress fold over a check worth 10,000. I've watched entire committees bend to fossil fuel giants who can't even pronounce the names of the communities they poison. But here you are, standing in the dust of a scorched nation, refusing to sell what little you have left, because what you have left is sacred. She stepped back, her chest heaving slightly, then took a breath, not to calm herself, but to strike deeper. So to the wealthy nations, the G7 members, the global investors, the ones who sit in towers and boardrooms and think the world is still a chessboard, I'm talking to you now. Her eyes narrowed. Stop buying land in Africa just to steal its water. Stop calling it strategic acquisition when it's resource colonialism in a new suit. Stop pushing contracts that give your corporations 30-year water access rights while the children in those villages walk 6 miles with empty buckets. Stop pretending your development aid isn't just a dam built upstream with a lock and key held in Zurich. The room was breathless. Cameras panned slowly across the faces of diplomats who no longer scribbled in notebooks. Jasmine raised her voice, not to shout, but to pierce. You do not have the right to bottle another country's rainfall and ship it to supermarkets in Europe. You do not have the right to drain lakes in Malawi, in Burkina Faso, in Kenya, just to stock private reservoirs for your golf courses and luxury spas. You do not get to treat water like a commodity when it is the very breath of the earth. She leaned closer to the microphone, her voice lowering but becoming even more dangerous in its precision. This is not an appeal to your charity. This is a warning. Because if you keep treating African soil like your emergency reserve tank, if you keep stockpiling water while people collapse in line for rationed gallons, then don't ask why those same people rise up and say, enough. She paused. The silence was total. Then she ended, not with a plea, but with a sentence that broke through diplomatic pretense like a steel blade through silk. Stop locking life in vaults. Let the water flow to the people who thirst, not the people who speculate. And for a moment in that heavily guarded, air-conditioned chamber of power, the world stopped pretending it didn't hear her. Jasmine's final words still trembled in the air, like the echo of a verdict when the silence was broken. Not by applause, not by protocol, but by a man rising slowly into the full weight of history, knowing that his next words would not just be heard, they would be recorded by time. I was not going to speak again today, President Ibrahim Traoré said, his voice low, grave, carrying not the rehearsed rhythm of diplomacy, but the sharp stillness of conviction formed under pressure. But Congresswoman Crockett has spoken a truth so raw, so precise, that it would be cowardice not to respond. He didn't gesture. He didn't smile. He simply stood, tall, dust clinging to his cuffs, the sun from the Sahel bleaching his uniform to near bone white. His aides did not move. The teleprompter remained dark. This was not scripted. It was a rupture. So I will speak now, not as a president, but as a son of a land where water is not a commodity. It is a matter of dignity or death. His eyes scanned the summit screens, not with contempt, but with challenge. And because I know what it means to be left behind, I am choosing not to leave others behind. He stepped forward once, just enough to fill the center of the camera's frame. Not to dominate, but to be seen without filter. Burkina Faso will make our entire national water database open source. Every survey, every underground map, every seasonal fluctuation recorded by hand in village journals. We will release all our research on low-cost biofiltration methods, perfected by rural engineers using charcoal, clay, and crushed moringa seeds. We will share our reforestation blueprints, rainfall harvest models, and solar-powered irrigation systems, even the ones still unfinished. He paused, letting the magnitude of his words sink in. And we will share this knowledge, not with contracts, not with licenses, but freely, without precondition, without privilege, even with those whose flags once flew above our soil, because justice is not vengeance, and leadership is not leverage. A hush spread like a pressure wave through the room. His voice neither rose nor faltered. It simply pressed deeper. We have been robbed before, of minerals, of time, of language. But what we have rebuilt through suffering will not become the new currency of division. It will become a bridge. He drew a breath, jaw tight. Let it be known, Burkina Faso will stand with every nation too small to be heard, too poor to be noticed, too colonized to be trusted. His eyes sharpened as he delivered the final sentence. Not with emotion, but with a certainty that struck like lightning through still water. We remember who exploited us, but we will not become them. We will not hoard the rain while others burn. But while the room still reeled from his final sentence, President Traoré moved, not with flourish, but with finality, toward an act that would turn his words into law and his defiance into a global reckoning. The camera locked on him just as the dust kicked up behind his boots, framing a moment that didn't need amplification, only silence. Ibrahim Traoré didn't speak. He didn't consult anyone. Instead, he turned with calm certainty and reached for the battered leather case that had traveled with him to more village councils than international summits. He opened it without ceremony, revealing a single document inside, a national decree, pre-drafted, unsigned, its contents still unknown to every other leader in the room. The air around him thickened. Aides took half steps forward, unsure if they should intervene. But one glance from his side halted them cold. The cameras tightened. The live broadcast surged as viewership climbed by the second. Traoré unfastened the pen clipped to his chest, a gift from a teacher in Yatenga province, its lacquer chipped, the metal warm from his skin. With slow, unshaking hands, he laid the decree flat against a collapsible wooden lectern, a small gust catching the corner like the breath of something sacred. Then he raised the pen in full view of the summit's global feed, not for show, but so that the world would witness what it had waited too long to see, a leader who didn't ask for permission to do what was just. The tip of the pen met the paper, and with one bold, deliberate motion, he signed his name across the bottom. Not small, not bureaucratic, but large, slashing, permanent. One line, then a second, then a final dot that hit like a period at the end of an era. The moment detonated online before the ink had dried. Newsrooms scrambled to verify, but it was already too late. The act had been broadcast, raw and unedited. There was no spin, no press release, no translation needed. The world had seen what mattered. A man with no podium, no teleprompter, no armored convoy, just a piece of paper, a broken pen, and the authority of someone who had chosen solidarity over sovereignty and justice over revenge. For the first time in decades, a sub-Saharan leader had declared not war, not withdrawal, but open generosity in the face of historical betrayal. In villages across the Sahel, crowds gathered around battery-powered radios, listening not for promises, but for the silence that follows when something irreversible has just been set in motion. In European capitals, analysts scrambled to interpret the consequences. What it would mean if data, filtration models, and infrastructure designs were no longer part of the bidding war, but freely available to the very nations once locked out of survival. And in the eyes of those who had suffered in quiet, forgotten corners of the planet, that image, Traoré's hand over paper, unshaken, unowned, was not just a policy. It was proof that dignity could be legislated in real time. The cameras may have stopped rolling in Burkina Faso, but in Washington the blowback had just begun. And Jasmine Crockett, now back on American soil, found herself standing in the crosshairs of a storm she had long seen coming. The headlines hit like a slow-moving ambush. First came the op-eds, thinly veiled under the language of national interest and optics. Then the cable segments. Then the congressional floor. One by one, American lawmakers lined up to condemn her, not for lying, but for telling a truth they refused to hear. A sitting member of Congress praising a foreign autocrat, barked one senator from Texas, eyes gleaming under studio lights. It's not diplomacy, it's disgrace. Another accused her of romanticizing failed states. Others took it further, questioning her patriotism outright. How dare she applaud a regime while criticizing her own country? One headline screamed. They weren't offended by what she said. They were threatened by what it revealed. That a nation claiming moral authority had, in fact, lost its moral memory. Jasmine didn't flinch. But she felt it. The same hands that once applauded her for challenging injustice now pointed fingers, furious that she had applauded someone outside the circle of approved allies. In the corridors of Capitol Hill, she was met with stares colder than the marble. Colleagues who once clapped during her floor speeches now turned their backs in elevators. A private memo leaked from a Senate aide accused her of undermining America's global standing by legitimizing third world populism. The phrase stung, not because it was new, but because it echoed a deeper rot she had known since childhood. The quiet belief that dignity was something white and imported, not black and sovereign. Cable networks ran the same 10-second clip in a loop, her saying Traoré's name, her praising his decision to reject corporate water contracts, her calling Burkina Faso a beacon of moral clarity, edited without context, voiced over with manufactured outrage. A beacon of moral clarity? One pundit sneered. What about our military bases, our global aid? But none of them mentioned the part where Traoré shared water filtration technology with countries too poor to buy it. None replayed the clip of him signing that decree. What they feared wasn't her praise. It was the possibility that she meant every word. Then came the moment they didn't expect. Jasmine Crockett didn't retreat. She didn't issue a clarification. She didn't step behind a staffer-written statement. She went on live television. The network had offered her a 7-minute slot on a morning program known for softball interviews and safe talking points. She walked in with no notes, no PR handler, no soft smile, just the fire she'd carried from the red soil of the Sahel back into the halls of American hypocrisy. Under studio lights, her face was bare, uncompromising. The host, visibly uneasy, tried to ease into the controversy with pre-scripted neutrality. Congresswoman Crockett, some of your colleagues have expressed concern that your comments in support of President Traoré may have crossed a line, particularly given the sensitive nature of international diplomacy. Do you regret your statement? She didn't blink. I regret nothing, she said, each word slicing through the air like it had been waiting in her chest for years. What I said was not flattery, it was fact. I watched a man stand in the middle of a dying rice field and give away everything he had, not to secure power, but to protect life. I watched him sign away profit so his people could drink clean water without fear. Her tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. If that unsettles my colleagues, they should ask themselves why basic human dignity looks foreign to them. The host shifted, but she leaned in. I've been told I embarrassed this country by applauding an African president. But I've watched this country ignore poison towns, bankrupt school districts, and families rationing insulin like it's gold. So let's talk about embarrassment. She paused, and in that pause, the air turned electric. We send billions to regimes that butcher journalists. We sell weapons to governments that bomb hospitals. But the moment I call a black African leader ethical, suddenly it's treason. There was no music, no applause track, just the sound of her breathing, steady and razor-edged. Then she delivered the line that would tear through every screen in the country. If the truth makes you uncomfortable, then maybe the problem isn't what was said. It's what it reveals about you. She let it hang. You want to call it un-American? Fine. But ask yourself, what part of justice is un-American? What part of moral courage is un-American? Because if admiring a man who puts people above profit is now considered radical, then the problem isn't me. It's the standard you've set for patriotism. The anchor tried to pivot, something about optics, about context. But it didn't matter. The truth had already detonated. By the time she left the studio, her phone had exploded with texts from civil rights leaders, from small-town mayors, from teachers in underfunded schools, from mothers in places like Flint and Jackson and Baton Rouge. Thank you for saying it, they wrote. Thank you for not apologizing. One message stood out. It came from a community organizer in Detroit. You didn't just defend him. You defended us all, because we've been told our heroes don't look like that. And Jasmine knew then, this wasn't about one speech. It was about a line that had finally been crossed. A boundary pushed not with rage, but with clarity. Not with rebellion, but with truth. And that truth had teeth. And it wasn't going back in the cage. While the political world spun in outrage and commentary, far from the chambers of Congress and the echo chambers of television, The voices that truly mattered began to rise, not from podiums, but from dry earth and scarred hands, in the language of gratitude carved by survival. In the early hours of dawn, when the Sahel wind still carried a faint trace of coolness before the sun turned it into fire, Binta began her climb. She was over 60. No one knew her exact age, not even herself. But her spine was straight, and her feet knew the rocks by memory. In one hand, she carried a blue plastic water jug, worn smooth by years of use. In the other, she held a tool, a piece of sharp iron salvaged from a broken plow. With every step, her breath grew louder, not from fatigue, but from something heavier, something holy. She didn't speak. She didn't ask for help. She walked up that mountain alone, past crumbling footpaths and old trees that hadn't seen leaves in seasons. At the summit, she knelt, and with fingers calloused from decades of pounding grain, she began to etch words into the jug's hardened shell. "Jasmine, we heard your voice from across the ocean." The engraving took over an hour. The wind tore at her headscarf. Dust stung her eyes. Blood rose in her knuckles where the iron slipped. But she didn't stop. She pressed each letter into the plastic like it was stone. This wasn't a performance. No camera crew, no reporters. Just an old woman, a water jug, and the name of a stranger who, for the first time in her life, had spoken into a microphone and said, "You matter." When she finished, she held the jug above her head, the words catching the first rays of sunlight. And for a moment, on that silent ridge above a silent village, it was as if the earth itself had answered back. 2 miles below, in a one-room school built of tin sheets and mud bricks, a boy named Maury sat with a pencil clutched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He was 8. His uniform was torn at the collar, his sandals held together with wire. But his posture was perfect, as if the act of writing required discipline. Around him, other students giggled and whispered, but Maury didn't lift his head. On a wrinkled sheet of paper pulled from the back of an old workbook, he was drafting something rare. A letter. Not for a grade, not for an assignment. For someone he'd never met, but now considered his reason for dreaming. He had watched the summit on a rusted battery-powered radio with his father, the village caretaker. The translation was spotty, the signal fuzzy, but he'd heard one name repeated again and again. Jasmine. The woman who spoke like thunder. The one who stood beside his president and said the world needed to learn from a country the world had tried to forget. After the summit, Maury's father told him, "That woman has never been to our village, but she fights for it anyway." That night, Maury didn't sleep. He stared at the stars and thought about water, about wells, about the line of people every morning who came to fill their buckets while his father turned the old pump by hand. Now, as the classroom filled with heat and flies, he bent over the page and pressed each word into the paper like a vow. "My name is Maury. I am in 2nd grade. I want to be like President Traoré when I grow up. I want to protect the well in our village, because it gives us life. I want to make sure no one takes it, not even people with money. Thank you for fighting with us. Thank you for saying we are strong. Please do not forget us. I will not forget you." He folded the page carefully, sealing it inside the torn envelope of an old electricity bill. He had never sent a letter before, didn't even know how mail worked, but he didn't care. He brought it to his teacher and asked, voice barely above a whisper, "Can this go to America?" The teacher smiled gently, tears rising uninvited. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe it already has." Outside, a group of women waited in the dust for their turn at the hand pump. One of them held a jerry can with Binta's engraving. The words had already begun to fade under the morning glare, but the name, Jasmine, remained bold and sharp. One of the younger women traced it with her finger and whispered, "She said the water belongs to us, not to them." Another replied, "She said our pain is not too small to speak aloud." And that was how it spread. Not with hashtags, not with headlines, but in whispers passed from mother to daughter, from son to father, from well to fire pit. A name, a voice, a moment that had crossed oceans and struck not at the centers of power, but at the edges of survival, where people didn't need slogans. They needed someone to look into a camera and say, "You matter. I see you. I will not let them forget you. And from that point on, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a name in the news. She was a carved word on a water jug. She was a line in a child's letter. She was the voice that reached where power never had. But sometimes words do not belong only in speeches or headlines. They must be carved into the earth, into stone, into monuments that cannot be erased, so that those who live at the margins remember, and those in power are forced to. In the northern desert plains of Burkina Faso, where the sun crushed the horizon with a slow, merciless hand, and the wind blew red with sand, a convoy of workers moved across the dust like ants towards something ancient in spirit, but brand new in form. They weren't building a dam or digging another well. They were delivering a monolith. A single slab of granite, quarried from the country's interior, had been transported by truck over 400 kilometers to a place where no foreign executive, no diplomat, no mining magnate would bother to go, because there was nothing to take, until now. President Ibrahim Traoré had chosen the location himself. It was not symbolic, it was personal. This was the exact stretch of land where, 6 years earlier, a European energy consortium had proposed to build a groundwater extraction facility, promising jobs, power, and prosperity. Instead, after protest and resistance, the land remained untouched. The only thing ever taken from it was dignity, and now something would be given back. The workers lowered the stone onto its foundation, just as the wind kicked up a curtain of sand that half-blinded the camera crews. But the words engraved on the face of the stone refused to disappear. The carving had been done by hand. Each letter measured 5 inches tall. It didn't carry a government seal or a party insignia, just the quote, chiseled so deep that not even a century of storms could wear it away. Water is not a privilege. It is a human right. Jasmine Crockett. Traoré arrived not in a motorcade, but on foot, escorted by local village elders and barefoot children who had walked 3 miles to see what had only been spoken of on radios. He placed his hand on the stone as if to feel the heat it had absorbed from the sun. "This is not just for us," he said quietly to the press gathered around. "It's for those who come after, and those who will never be mentioned in any history book." He did not give a long speech. He didn't need to. The stone said everything. Word spread fast, not through government channels, but through grainy WhatsApp videos and transistor radios. In schools, teachers paused lessons and told students to memorize the sentence. In markets, women passed around photographs like sacred scrolls. Farmers who couldn't read traced the letters with their fingers and asked their sons to recite the phrase out loud. In a land where water had been rationed, sold, and hoarded, the idea that someone across the ocean had said you deserve this, not because you're useful, but because you're human, that was the revolution. But it didn't stop there. 12 days later and 6,000 miles away, under the steel sky of Washington, D.C., another slab was rising, this time in the most politically charged patch of land in America, Capitol Hill. Jasmine Crockett had remained silent through the backlash, through the editorials and the veiled accusations. But she hadn't been idle. She had commissioned a replica, smaller in size but identical in message, to be installed on a patch of public space facing the eastern steps of Congress. It was made of black Vermont slate, chosen not for prestige but for contrast. Against the white stone buildings of American power, the blackness would scream. The installation happened quietly, at dawn. No ribbon cutting, no ceremony, just a crew of local stonemasons and volunteers, many from D.C.'s most neglected wards, who showed up to work because this one feels like it's for us. A child from Anacostia helped sweep the base. A retired librarian brought flowers. And as the final bolts locked into place, the same words emerged into morning light, etched in English and underneath it in Fulfulde, the regional tongue of northern Burkina Faso. Water is not a privilege. It is a human right. The reaction was nuclear. By 8:43 a.m., congressional aides were photographing it in disbelief. By 9:12 a.m., a House Republican from Missouri was calling it an unauthorized political monument promoting foreign regimes. By noon, 3 conservative think tanks had issued statements condemning it as anti-capitalist graffiti in stone. But by sunset, it was surrounded by candles. Not just activists, not just journalists, but veterans, nurses, bus drivers, mothers, janitors, people who had lived through boil notices, dry taps, unfiltered lead, people who didn't care where Burkina Faso was on a map, but knew exactly what it meant to be told your basic needs were a luxury. And still, Jasmine said nothing. Not until day 3. She stepped onto the plaza not flanked by security, but by residents from Flint, from Jackson, from the Bronx. She stood beneath her own words, not to explain them, but to amplify them. Reporters swarmed, cameras clicked, but her voice cut clean through. This is not about another country, she said. This is about every place where people line up for water like it's bread and wartime. It's about every politician who sees infrastructure as an afterthought. It's about every child who has to choose between brushing their teeth and saving a bottle for school. She turned toward the Capitol behind her, cold and silent in the early light. If these words make some people uncomfortable, good. Let them be uncomfortable, because for too long, comfort has been built on someone else's thirst. She didn't stay long. She didn't need to. By that evening, someone had chalked "thank you" in 6 languages across the sidewalk around the monument. A choir from a local school sang Sam Cooke's "A Change Is Gonna Come." An undocumented grandmother left a jug of clean water with a note. This time, we give. Inside the Capitol, debate swirled. Lawmakers argued over its legality, its message, its optics. One senator called for its removal. Another offered to protect it under free speech law. One aide reportedly muttered, "This isn't just a rock, it's a damn indictment." And it was. Not because it accused, but because it existed, boldly, defiantly, undeniably, in the very heart of a system that had forgotten who democracy was supposed to serve. It didn't matter whether they liked it. The stone would stay, just like the one in the desert, just like the truth it carried, just like the people it honored. The stone remained unmoved, untouched, but it was never silent. And as its message echoed from desert winds to DC sidewalks, something began to shift beneath the noise. Not policy, but purpose. And not from politicians, but from the people they had long ignored. It began, as most revolutions do, not with speeches or signatures, but with whispers, passed through dirt roads, kitchen tables, factory floors, and overcrowded clinics. The stone outside Capitol Hill had not been touched, but the ripple it unleashed moved with force through corridors that thought themselves untouchable. The world had seen enough summits filled with nothing but polished lies. What it craved now was action, substance, sweat, steel, and it came, not from parliaments or presidents, but from the people who had spent their lives walking to wells, boiling silence into resistance. 1 year later to the day, under a sky bruised with storm clouds and tension, 4 nations gathered not beneath a UN banner, not in a gilded ballroom, but in the open-air courtyard of a community-built water research center on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. There was no red carpet, no black SUVs, just tarps strung between poles, farmers and engineers side by side, and rows of folding chairs filled not with donors but with doers, those who had survived water injustice and lived long enough to fight it back. They called it the Global Flow Accord, but on the ground people had already renamed it in their own tongues. Le Fleuve du Peuple, La Corriente del Pueblo, the flow of the people. It was not a treaty of convenience. It was a reckoning in ink. For the first time, the United States, Burkina Faso, Ghana, and Peru were signing a legally binding multilateral civilian-driven agreement, not just to protect water, but to liberate it, to shield it from profit motives, to exchange ideas across oceans without charging licensing fees, to create an unbreakable pipeline of knowledge, protection, and defense around the most sacred resource humanity had left. The tension was palpable. This was not a feel-good ceremony. It was a declaration against an entrenched order. Behind the smiles were threats. The IMF had issued 3 veiled warnings. 3 major agricultural conglomerates had pulled lobbying dollars from the deal. One foreign minister had walked out the week before. But the people stayed. They filled the chairs. They stood behind the cameras. They brought their children and their buckets, their letters and their broken promises, and they came to witness what many said was impossible, an alliance that owed nothing to banks and everything to survival. Jasmine Crockett stood beneath the tarp in a simple navy blouse, her sleeves rolled, her eyes unwavering. Across from her stood President Traoré, weathered but proud, surrounded by his engineers, his village elders, his barefoot witnesses. Beside them, the health minister of Peru wiped rain off his clipboard. The Ghanaian delegate, a former rural teacher, held the hand of a boy who had nearly died in a cholera outbreak the year before. These were not dignitaries. They were insurgents in suits, builders in boots, defenders of dignity who knew that water did not care about borders, and neither should those who protect it. A moderator approached the table. He didn't speak in diplomatic platitudes. He simply read the first clause aloud. Article 1. Water is a shared inheritance of humanity. No nation, corporation, or institution may restrict access to knowledge that protects it, purifies it, or defends it. That was the start. Clause after clause followed, each one forged from real wounds. Article 3. No filtration design patented by signatory nations may be sold to another developing nation at a profit. Article 7. Community water defenders shall be granted asylum in any signatory state if persecuted for their work. Article 10. A joint emergency fund shall be activated within 72 hours of any water crisis, bypassing traditional aid bureaucracies. By the time the final article was read, the storm above had begun to break. Rain fell, not in sheets, but in rhythm. Not enough to drown voices, but just enough to remind everyone why they were there. People did not scatter. They lifted their faces to the sky and let the water bless the moment. One grandmother from Ghana whispered, "Let the paper get wet. Let the ink run, so long as the promise holds." When the time came to sign, no one reached for gold pens. Instead, each leader stepped forward and dipped a simple wooden quill into a bowl of purified stormwater, a symbol drawn from a ritual in the Andean highlands, where elders once signed declarations of peace with water collected from their most sacred lagoons. Jasmine was the last to step forward. As she dipped the quill into the basin, her reflection wavered on the surface, fractured by each raindrop, but her hand was steady. She signed, Jasmine Crockett, on behalf of the people who were told their thirst didn't matter. As the ink dried, reporters jostled for statements, but Jasmine didn't give a soundbite. She stepped down from the platform and walked into the crowd, toward the water defenders, the school children, the engineers with dirt still on their hands. She shook hands. She hugged a woman who'd lost her son during a typhoid outbreak linked to unfiltered runoff. She knelt beside a farmer who had donated his land to build the community well. And then, without warning, someone handed her a metal bucket with a message scratched into it in 2 languages. We remember who poisoned us, but today we choose to heal together. The crowd erupted, not in applause, but in something deeper, chanting, words rising not from joy alone, but from exhaustion, vindication, fury turned into purpose. Inside the press tent, a Western correspondent turned to his producer and whispered, "This isn't diplomacy. This is a jailbreak." And it was, because outside the polished chambers of power, a new kind of treaty had just been born, one with no lobbyists, no loopholes, no lifeless slogans, one carved from scars, one written with rain, and its name wasn't coined in a conference room. It was whispered into every cracked pipeline, every rusted faucet, every well run dry. The flow of the people, and this time it would not be dammed. Under the shadow of that rain-soaked signing ceremony, with the ink still drying on a document forged by history and hunger, a new world began to whisper itself into being. But in Washington, D.C., thousands of miles from Ouagadougou, where the walls of power are thicker and colder, not everyone was ready to listen. As the press assembled in the Capitol briefing room, clutching cameras, pads, and pre-written headlines, Jasmine Crockett stood at the podium, not as a politician or policy architect, but as a woman who had just watched something extraordinary. A nation once dismissed as fragile had stood taller than the world's richest empires, simply by choosing its people over its profits. She was dressed in charcoal gray, her voice calm, but beneath the stillness lived a quiet storm. The microphones clicked on. The lights flared. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She leaned forward, eyes sweeping across the room, and then, almost disarmingly, she smiled. It wasn't a smile of victory. It was the smile of someone who had fought too long to believe in miracles and just witnessed one anyway. I didn't think my words would change anything that day, she began, her tone steady, pulling the room into absolute silence. I thought they would land like they usually do, in a void, buried beneath committee reports and headlines about celebrity divorces. I spoke because silence would have hurt more, not because I believed the world would listen. The room sat breathless. Even the reporters trained to chase scandal, not soul, lowered their pens. But then, she continued, voice lowering, a president in a land parched by history did something I've never seen a G20 leader do. He didn't seize power. He didn't hoard water. He didn't ask what was profitable or politically convenient. He heard the voice of someone far away, with no strategic leverage, and said, "This matters." Her voice cracked, not from weakness, but from magnitude. President Traoré made the world believe that dignity could flow like water, through borders, across time zones, beneath the feet of those who were told they were voiceless. At that line, the flashbulbs exploded, but Jasmine didn't pause. She kept going, the rhythm rising, every word like a wave crashing against the shore of a system too long anchored in cynicism. When we met on that screen, I didn't see a foreign leader, she said. I saw a mirror, a reflection of every child in Alabama who drank lead before they could spell the word injustice, of every grandmother in Wahaguya who walks 6 miles for a bucket of water and still manages to sing. I saw someone who didn't just govern, but who grieved, who hoped, who dared to believe that global power doesn't come from stockpiles, but from sacrifice. She took a breath. One slow, trembling breath. And then her eyes locked with the CNN reporter in the front row. You all asked me why I praised him. You asked me if that was unpatriotic. You asked me if it was appropriate. So let me answer. I praised him because, for once, someone chose people over pipelines. And if that makes you uncomfortable, ask yourself why the truth feels like a betrayal. Gasps rippled, not from outrage, from awe. Even those who'd come looking to twist her words found themselves frozen, because what she delivered was not spin, but testimony. The moderator tried to move to the next question. Jasmine raised her hand. I'm not done. Another hush. I've sat in rooms where black women were talked over, where the poor were erased, where water policy was debated like a luxury, not a lifeline. But that day, the world paused. And for once, it listened to a voice it was never supposed to hear. Not because I was loud, but because someone with power chose to make space. And then, the line that wasn't planned, the one that history would remember more than any soundbite. Traoré reminded us that dignity doesn't trickle down. It floods up, from the cracks we've tried to hide, from the voices we've tried to silence, from the deserts we've abandoned. And now that it's begun, I dare you to try and stop it. You could hear the shudder in the room. Not applause, not yet. Just a silence that was earned. The kind that comes only when truth collides with expectation and leaves it in ruins. C-SPAN replayed the segment 12 times in 24 hours. Social media didn't trend it. They studied it. The press didn't spin it. They quoted it word for word. Because in that moment, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman. She was the conduit for a global current that had finally found its course. And somewhere, far from the cameras, in a desert where that sacred stone still stood, etched with the words, "Water is not a privilege, it is a human right," an old woman poured a tin cup into the soil, letting the water seep down like a prayer. She didn't say anything, but the land did. And somewhere else, in a Capitol office once deaf to struggle, a young staffer walked past that replica stone and paused. He touched the surface, whispered, "Let it flow." And it did. And when the cameras dimmed and the speeches faded into memory, something deeper lingered in the silence. A lesson not written into treaties or shouted from podiums, but carved into the marrow of two lives that dared to defy the system. It was in that quiet aftermath, After the declarations and applause, that the true weight of what had unfolded began to settle, not just between Crockett and Traoré, not just between Washington and Ouagadougou, but within the fault lines of a world that had long forgotten the price of dignity. Because this wasn't a story about aid. It wasn't about diplomacy or optics or headlines. It was about who gets to matter, about whether a child drinking from a poisoned well in Alabama deserves the same urgency as a child chasing a bucket of dust in Burkina Faso. And more than that, it was about the violence of indifference, the kind that wears suits, signs budgets, and calls its cruelty policy. The kind that Jasmine Crockett had faced since the first time she testified about water rations and saw congressional eyes glaze over like she was speaking a different language. Traoré, too, knew that language. The language of being overlooked. He had once been a soldier with no microphone, no audience, just sand in his boots and dead silence from the world. But now, with one sentence and one refusal to sign away his country's aquifers, he had rewritten the moral hierarchy of power and taught something no G7 summit ever had the courage to say: moral leadership does not belong to those with wealth, but to those willing to sacrifice comfort for justice. The lesson was brutal. It exposed who had always been allowed to define humanity and who had always been expected to survive without it. Jasmine had once fought just to keep a poor district's water flowing. Now she stood at the center of a global current, but the backlash came just as fast. In the days after the summit, pundits sneered. Political enemies called her a traitor to the flag for elevating an African president over American leaders. One senator even accused her of exporting shame, but Jasmine didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that telling the truth was always interpreted as rebellion when you weren't supposed to have a voice. She responded not with anger, but with clarity. If truth insults you, she told MSNBC, you should ask yourself why your comfort relies on silence. And that sentence, just 12 words, rippled further than any press release. It landed in classrooms, in protests, in the minds of people who had never before connected their dry faucets to someone else's overflowing vault. It reframed the idea of global connection, not as charity, but as responsibility. And that, perhaps, was the final lesson. That dignity cannot be localized. You cannot protect your own humanity while turning your back on someone else's. You cannot hoard clean water behind walls and expect to sleep at night knowing a child died from thirst just because they were born on the wrong side of an ocean. What Traoré and Jasmine ignited wasn't a political alliance. It was a confrontation with conscience, a demand that the world stop ranking whose suffering is profitable and whose is expendable. In the end, it wasn't about Burkina Faso or the United States. It was about the question echoing beneath every silence, every budget cut, every ignored village, and every dismissed girl with a cracked voice and a bucket in her hand. How much longer will we pretend that justice can exist without equality of survival? And when the next drought comes, when the next hearing opens, and someone dares to ask what a glass of water is worth, someone, somewhere, will remember that day. That one woman from Texas and one soldier from West Africa didn't wait for permission to change the answer. They gave it to the world, and now the world must choose what to do with it. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.